Today's episode is brought to you by Mazars. SoundCartel. You found the perfect location for your business, and now's the time to negotiate the lease. But Paul Brennan of Brennans Solicitors warns, beware. From SoundCartel, I'm Nicole Goodman, and this is Business Essentials Daily. Paul says a slip-up can occur when discussing terms on a property lease and signing on the dotted line. His best advice? Consult a lawyer. His second best advice? Negotiate hard with the real estate agent, who will be more flexible than the landlord's lawyers, who won't be flexible at all. He explains to Heather Dawson.
The real estate agent's always great. He wants to get the deal done and he's very motivated, and he will compromise and he'll persuade the landlord maybe to bend a little. But once you get to a lawyer's, they have a completely different view of things. It might seem to other people that we don't even really care if the commercial deal goes ahead or not, which is maybe a bit harsh. But the idea is once you get to the lawyer, the terms must stay the same. He will be advising the landlord not to waive when the tenant asks for anything. So if you're going to have any compromises, it has to be at the real estate agent stage.
Well, how do you avoid being had over a barrel at this early stage?
Well, I think there's certain things that you need to negotiate and need to know to negotiate about it. So you could even go to your lawyer quite early on and just say to him, what should I do to negotiate this lease? And he'll outline certain things. And once you have those under your belt, you're really better hit at the things that you need to get right in the early stages.
Now, you've got 7 tips, Paul, on clauses to look out for in the lease. So let's just go through some of those. You start with rental terms.
Yeah, these are 7 of the tips that perhaps your lawyer would tell you about. I think the first thing is look at the terms of the rental, and you need to be able to get out. It's not just good enough just to see that the rent's going to be a certain amount. You need to make sure that you can offload the lease to somebody else.
Then the question of subletting.
Subletting. If you've got premises and business is not going so well, or you're not using enough of them, then it's a great idea to be able to let it to someone else, to get someone else in those premises. Well, unless it says that you can do that in the lease, then you can't do it. So you'll end up sitting in somewhere like the Albert Hall or the Sydney Opera House with no one else there, whereas really you could be gaining income from that rent.
Now, the question of annual rent reviews as well. You need to look at that.
This is a big one, because what it means is that you can rent the property or take the property at a certain rent which seems reasonable to you. If there's a market review after a year or 2 years, you may find your rent even doubling. So often landlords, what they do is they will get you in on a certain low rent only to put up the rent a great deal. So you have to be very careful about that as far as market reviews are concerned. The other type of reviews you can have are fixed percentage. There could actually be a fixed percentage review every year, or for instance a CPI review every year. And these are quite common nowadays, but at the real estate agent stage, when they want to do the deal, these are things you can really negotiate about.
Then there's personal guarantees, which is often what the landlord wants, of course.
Look, the landlord will always want a personal guarantee if you are taking the lease in the name of a company. And this is something you need to do fairly early on. You need to get normally husbands and wives or partners, they have the property in both names because that seems to be the most sensible way to proceed. You don't really want that. You want your property and anything of value in the other person's name so that you do the business and you take the risks and your wife or your husband has the assets. And if you do this, then the landlord will not ask your husband or wife for a personal guarantee, and therefore your house will not be at risk. Big one there.
What about the deposit?
Traditionally, deposits, they normally ask for a number of months of rent, say even sort of 6 months of rent just held there over a period of 2 or 5 or however long the lease is. It's becoming increasingly common to get some sort of bank guarantee or bond or something to secure this rather than having the money tied up. But it would be even better just to try to reduce that down to the minimum when you're negotiating with the estate agent, because the landlord will see it not as giving up very much, whereas once he gets to his lawyer, the lawyer will say, listen, you need as much security as you want, so you won't get any joy there.
Now, you advised looking out for that clause on who's responsible for repairs, but you'd assume that the landlord would be responsible in most cases, wouldn't you?
Well, look, you would assume that. But if the lease doesn't say it, then they're not responsible. So be very careful. Leases are not standard. It's all a matter of negotiation. So make sure that one line in the initial sort of discussions with the estate agent, the landlord's responsible for repairs.
I guess you shouldn't forget things like insurance as well.
Insurance, the way to deal with that, you will find several pages in the lease which refer to public liability insurance and all sorts of things, fairly long clauses. All you do is you photocopy the parcel off and send them out to an insurance broker. He doesn't charge you by the hour. He will just do the deal and get commission. It's money well spent.
You look at your outgoings?
Outgoings are another one. You know, when you negotiate the deal, you normally just look at the rent and you don't pay much attention, maybe, if you haven't done this before, to outgoings. But it's very important to know what the amounts of the outgoings are and who pays for what.
You also advise, Paul, checking on demolition or renovation clauses.
Look, in the leases, sometimes the landlord obviously will give it to you for a long term, but there'll be one clause in there which will say, unless I want to redevelop the site, then you have to move. Or, for instance, unless I want to do some repairs, then you have to move for 2 months and then come back. Really, if it's got a demolition or a renovation clause, forget it and go and find somewhere else. I know that sometimes in some areas rental property is very hard to find, but those can cause such disruption to your business. Just avoid them would be my advice.
And you also advise double-checking on clauses relating to the use of the premises.
This is really important, and not difficult to do. Normally, this is something in the items clause, that handy list in the lease, which just gives you the main sort of details, the names. There'll be one called use, and really that's got to be as broad as possible. I've seen arguments over all sorts of things, like the use says office, but the person wants to use it for some sort of shop. You've got to make sure it's right. But also I've seen in there that you're restricted to selling bottles of Coke rather than bottles of lemonade. So you've got to make sure that it's as broad enough to do the business that you need to do today and also in 5 years or 10 years while the lease is still going on.
And finally, put your lease offer in writing.
I think that really what will happen is that once you finish your negotiations with the agents, the next stop will be a 30-page lease document. And so therefore, really, you get the agent to put the negotiations in writing. So the solicitor basically has to do what the agent says rather than him going off and putting in some pretty harsh terms.
Well, Paul, that's a lot to take on board, but you have some more tips for us.
Well, look, I would suggest anybody listening to this, do your bail application for a murderer because you know you're not going to get it, so it's the easiest thing in the world, but don't negotiate your own lease because it will probably, more likely, end in tears. Get a lawyer to do this. You get lawyers who actually like to read leases. I know that sounds very sad, but it's money well spent.
And read the lease yourself as well.
Oh, look, that's definitely... I know it's the most boring document in the world, but you've got to sit down with a scotch or a gin and tonic and actually read it yourself, or you will suffer at the end of the day. It's no use at the end of the day saying your lawyer didn't advise you of this or that. What you sign is what you know, and it can lead you to a lot of problems if there's something in the lease which you can see is obviously wrong.
That was Brennans Solicitors Principal, Paul Brennan. And Paul will be back again on Be Daily to help us navigate trademarks and the law. This episode of Business Essentials Daily is produced by the team at SoundCartel. Thanks for listening. I'm Nicole Goodman. We'll bring you more Be Daily tomorrow. Follow at BE Daily Podcast across social media and head to bedaily.com.au for more from the Business Essentials Daily podcast. SoundCartel. This episode was brought to you by Mazars. To find out more, visit mazars.com.au. That's mazars.com.au.